Thank you very much for coming out tonight to hear what I have to tell you. And I would like to especially thank Judy Sikowski for arranging all of this and keeping in good email contact and taking care of me very well. And Will Rogers for picking me up and doing the introductions and taking care of me there. And for Pamela Smith, who accompanied us to dinner tonight. So thank you all very much. I'm delighted to be here. I once heard a Jungian analyst talk about how the first time he arrived in Zurich, he was absolutely ecstatic to be in such a beautiful old city that seemed so full of everything Jung had talked about. And I think any of us who have been to Zurich can relate to that and feel much the same way. But one of the difficulties with that is that Jung wrote in the early and mid-20th century, and even in the late 19th century. And so much of what he wrote is considered to be a product of that time and essentially limited to the knowledge base at that time. And many people feel that Jungian psychology hasn't really quite kept up with what's going on in the world. Now, there are other people who feel that's quite different. There's been quite a bit of work done on quantum mechanics and its relationship to complex theory and all of that. But actually, the science of today, which is a kind of biological analog to the physical alchemical work of hundreds of years ago, the alchemy of today, the organic alchemy of today, is really talking about exactly the same things that Jung was talking about. And what we're going to do tonight is we're going to look at what science is coming up with that essentially parallels what Jung was talking about, in a way that we can then begin to understand a little better what Jung was talking about, because we can coordinate it with our more current up-to-date understanding of the way things are made and the way things progress. So just to start off, I'd like to read 4 rather laborious quotations from Jung talking about the psychoid. And the psychoid is something that isn't mentioned a lot in Jung, but where it is mentioned, it's absolutely critical to understanding what he's talking about. But to start out, before we even do that, I want to give you a quotation from Jung that I learned years ago and have since begun every lecture I've ever given with this particular quotation, which, for those of you listening at home, is, "Never do human beings speculate more or have more opinions than about things which they do not understand." And that's humorous, but on the other hand, we really don't understand the psyche, and we essentially never will. But the urgency to try to learn more and more about it is what keeps us at this year after year. So here are a couple of quotations, 4 quotations on the psychoid. What is the psychoid? Jung in volume 8 quotes Driesch, one of the researchers of his day, who says, Jung says of Driesch, by the psychoid, he understands the directing principle. Notice the word directing. The reactive determinant, the prospective potency of the germinal element. It is the elemental agent discovered in action, the entelechy of real acting. And entelechy is a kind of Aristotelian word that means making the potential actual. Then Jung, of course, quotes Bleuler, who he worked with and admired greatly. He says, Bleuler uses the expression, the psychoid, as a collective term, chiefly for the subcortical processes, what we might call the amygdala and the hippocampus and that part of the brain. So far as they are concerned with biological adaptive functions, keep that word adaptive in your mind. Among these, Bleuler lists reflexes and the development of species, and keep the word development in your mind. He defines it as follows. The psychoid is the sum of all purposes, mnemonic and life-preserving functions of the body and the nervous system, with the exception of those cortical functions which we have always been accustomed to regard as psychic. So what we're getting at is what is the overlap here, and what is the interaction between physiology and psychology. And then finally, or no, two more, where instinct predominates, psychoid processes set in, which pertain to the sphere of the unconscious as elements incapable of consciousness. Here's our quotation again. Elements incapable of consciousness. The psychoid aura, he says in volume 14, the psychoid aura that surrounds consciousness furnishes us with better and less controversial possibilities of explanation, and moreover can be investigated empirically. It produces a world of relatively autonomous, keep that word in mind, images, including the manifold God images. Okay, so let's look at where this all starts, and let's look at where this kind of gets going. And I'd like to present to you a case study of a man who we will, to kind of disguise and keep the confidentiality intact, we will just call Mike. Mike, when he was a young boy, his first memories are something that we as analysts are always interested in hearing about. His first memory was of his mother taking his picture. And he remembers it was just after he started to walk, and he remembers walking toward the camera and his mother taking the picture. Years later, he saw that picture. He actually saw it, and he remembered that particular time in his life. So here was a guy who grew up in a very happy household where he was kind of, in many ways, the center of attention as the youngest kid in the family, that kind of a thing. But round about fourth grade, something happened to Mike. Mike was considered to be very intelligent. And in those days, what his school proposed, because of his intelligence, was to skip him from fourth grade to fifth grade. The school had never done this before. This was entirely new. He was the first. And Mike, on the one hand, realized, oh, this is a tremendous honor. You know, here I am. I'm considered to be the smartest kid in the class. They're promoting me into fifth grade. But he didn't want to go. He didn't want to go into fifth grade because he was going to leave behind all of his friends. He was going to go into a group of people, all of whom were a year older than he was, and he just didn't want to do it. But he realized he had to. So he did. He went into fifth grade, and the first day in fifth grade, they skipped him over Thanksgiving break. He left for Thanksgiving a fourth grader. He arrived back after Thanksgiving a fifth grader, went into the fifth grade classroom, and sat there and cried all day. Totally, completely humiliated. His world collapsed on him. Shortly thereafter, he had a dream. Here we go, okay? Coming right out of the unconscious. And the dream was this. The dream was that the most popular boy in class, who Mike really liked and who had kind of befriended him, was riding in the basket of his bicycle. And Mike was riding his bicycle near a big lake, and he stopped. And he took this kid and threw him as far as he could out into the lake. Wow. Okay? First thing. Years and years later, Mike was taking LSD. He was doing marijuana, taking LSD, and his trips were not as they were generally described as these amazing, kind of wonderful, flowery love and happiness and joy. His trips were awful. He just hated it. But he kept at it because he was kind of interested in what was going on. You could see Mike was already developing a kind of an interest in the mind. So Mike kept at it, and he realized one day, when he was tripping, that every time he sat down next to people, they got up and left. And that's why he was feeling so terrible. And he decided, okay, the next time I sit down next to somebody and they leave, I'm going to turn to them and ask them why they're leaving. You know, he was coherent enough in his acid trip to be able to do that. So he sat down, and the person next to him immediately got up. And so Mike looked up at the person and said, "Why are you leaving?" And the person turned around, and it was Mike. It was himself. Yeah, this is one of the wonderful things about LSD. You know, I mean, it just kind of brings it. It's a great clinical tool. I wish we could use it, but we can't. That's a whole other story. Years and years later, Mike was alone in his room. He was unemployed, and he was alone, and he was living in a place where he really couldn't talk to anybody because he didn't really understand the language. He'd been doing some world traveling type stuff. And he suddenly got depressed. And he got more and more and more depressed. And as he got depressed, he began to hear this rhythm in his mind. And the rhythm was going dun 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 dun, and he realized that he was losing his mind. Or more accurately, he was losing control over his mind. The control that we all, in some sort of delusional state, think we have over our minds. But he was losing it. And suddenly this thought came to him, and he had to write it down. And he wrote it down, and what he had written, he realized, was, when you address me, who is the me you are addressing? Starting really in 4th grade, right after that time, he had become so alienated from himself that he really literally didn't know who he was. Now, a lot of us go through that without being severely alienated from ourselves. We don't really know who we are either. That's kind of a routine thing to happen. But all through his life, his unconscious was giving him images of this fact. And now Mike really knew he had to do something about it. And, of course, found himself in Jungian analysis. So let's just shift now from that to parasites. I don't know how interested you are in parasites, but if you're not interested in parasites, you should be interested in parasites because they are utterly fascinating. And there's a book that I've recommended that we may not have, it may be out of print. So we may not have been able to stock it, but check it. And if it's on the back shelf there, buy it. And if it's out of print, go down to Powell's, find it wherever you can and buy it. It's a great book. It's called Parasite Rex, like Tyrannosaurus Rex. Parasite Rex. And in it you will read the following story. There's a little worm, very interesting little worm, that can only reproduce, it's a parasite. It can only reproduce in a sheep's gut. Now, some of you probably have already heard about this because it's just an absolutely extraordinarily famous story. There's a problem, though, with reproducing in a sheep's gut, and that is you rapidly become part of the sheep's excrement, and that is outside the sheep. So now you are a little worm parasite that is out of the sheep's gut and cannot reproduce. What are you going to do? You're SOL here, you know. It's like that wonderful Gary Larson cartoon you've probably seen, where there are 2 goldfish and they're on a table, and the goldfish bowl, the water is burning, and the one goldfish says to the other, that was close, but now we're equally screwed, you know, which is a great kind of cartoon. So this is what it was like for this parasite. He's equally screwed. He's out of the sheep. What's he going to do? Well, what the parasite does is, while he's in the sheep, he gets the sheep to excrete along with the excrement something that just seems really attractive to slugs. And this is a disgusting story, but it's absolutely fascinating. So along come the slugs, and they eat the excrement. This is why we don't like slugs, and this is why we don't eat slugs, you know, that's kind of thing, among other things. Eats the excrement, and now the parasite is in the slug, where the slug alters the body chemistry, or the parasite alters the body chemistry of the slug, so that as the slug slides along the ground, its slime is changed. And it's changed in a way that is highly attractive to ants. And ants come along and they eat the slug slime. And now the parasite is in the ant. Now, any of us who were kids and loved to lie on the front lawn and look in the grass and see everything that existed down there, we all know that ants like to crawl on the ground. They're not prone to climbing up to the top of grass. But the parasite changes the internal chemistry of the ant so that now the ant is heliotropic, loves the sun. Sort of like us when we go to California or Florida and lie out in the sun. The ant just wants to get up as close to the sun as possible, goes to the top of the grass, where along comes the sheep and eats the grass, eats the ant, and the parasite is back inside the sheep, where it can reproduce. Now, one can probably imagine that the parasite is not sitting there in all of these things thinking, oh man, I'm SOL, I'm in the sheep excrement, I have to do something. What could I do? Well, maybe I'll manufacture something that's attractive to, slugs maybe, because then I could... This all just happens, and it's utterly brilliant. There's another little worm that can only reproduce in a fish's gut, like a heron. And again, same problem. You reproduce in a heron's gut, and very soon you're part of the heron excrement, and you're out of the heron. So what do? Well, you get into the water, and you create an atmosphere, a fragrance, if you will, that's highly attractive to a certain kind of fish. And the fish comes along and eats some of this excrement where you are. I'm not going to tell you what fish it is. You'll probably never eat it again. But, that's just what happens with the natural world. It all goes on. The fish eats the excrement. The parasite is in the fish, and it changes the fish's behavior. So that now the fish is heliotropic. And what the fish really loves to do is lie on the surface of the water and flop around in the warmth of the sun, where the heron comes along and eats the fish. And now the parasite is in the heron. Yeah? Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant solutions to unsolvable problems that these parasites do, all at the level of chemistry, and all at the level of biochemistry, changing DNA, that kind of thing. Here's another example of this kind of thing. A woman has lupus. She has 6 months to live. She comes into analysis, hoping maybe analysis can help her. And she has a recurring dream. And the recurring dream is that she's being chased down a dark hallway by a man. And she knows that this man is going to rape and kill her. So she wakes up. Obviously, a very good thing to do when you're having a dream like that. Wake up. And it's repetitive over and over. But as she is encouraged to dream the dream onward, when you're awake, come up with an ending that you like. She begins to dream, or she begins to imagine that, okay, she wakes up when the guy's chasing her, so she runs very fast and gets away from the guy, and she's fine. Or she imagines when she has the dream the next time and she's awake that the guy trips and falls, and she gets away. So what's happening now is she's contributing to the unconscious in its desire to be able to work through this situation, but the problem being is she keeps waking up before it can do that, so now she's assisting that process, and lo and behold, after about 2 months, she has a dream where she's running down the hallway and she's being chased by a man who's going to rape and kill her. And this time, in the dream, she stops and she turns around to confront him, and he's a 10-year-old boy, and he's lost and he can't find his way home. She knows also from some of the work she's done, but she knows this anyway, that one of the significant events in her life was that her father died when she was 10, at which point her mother had to go back to work. The family was essentially without a mother, without a father, and she was absolutely devastated by all of this. After the dream, she goes and has her prednisone checked, and the people who are checking the prednisone say, "Whoa, you're way over-medicated," and they cut it back by half. As of about 3 years ago, she was still alive. What's going on with that? Example after example of these things that happen at the level of biochemistry that somehow have something to do with what the unconscious is trying to tell us. It can even happen at the group level. For example, a policeman doing his job. He's lucky to be employed. Unemployment is very high in his country, very few jobs. He's walking through the market one day and he sees a vendor and he's checking on people's permits. And he goes up to this vendor and he says, "Well, I have to see your permit." And the vendor doesn't have a permit. No permit. So, what does the policeman do? He says, "Got to shut you down. Sorry, no permit. You can't work. You can't have a market stall here." Shuts the guy down. The guy who has no other options in life kills himself by dousing himself with gasoline and self-immolating in Tunis, in Tunisia, in January. And bam, it goes to Egypt, and it goes to Bahrain, and it goes to Yemen, and it goes to Libya, and it goes to Morocco, and it goes to Oman, and it goes to Saudi Arabia. Like a flash through all of these people. It's like when we were kids in chemistry class, and they would do a supersaturated solution for us, like calcium chloride or potassium chloride, and they'd put it in a beaker, and they'd heat the beaker, so it could take more and more potassium chloride. We'd fill it up, and then they'd cool it down very slowly. And it would just be clear water, and they would take one crystal of potassium chloride on the end of a little glass thing and stick it right on the top of the water, and the whole thing would crystallize out instantly. Remember that? Remember that from your chemistry class? Yeah, one of the few things that was really fun in chemistry class in many ways. What's going on with all of this? We're looking at physiological processes and psychological behavior. Now, here's my PowerPoint presentation. It consists of 5 slides. Slide number 2 is the devil. And the devil is talking to one of his minions, and he says, I need someone well-versed in the art of torture. Do you know PowerPoint? That's how I feel about PowerPoint. So we're not going to have a lot of PowerPoint tonight. What we're going to have instead is fractal attractors. Why? Because this is the dynamic that is at the core of everything we're talking about. And this is the dynamic that is at the core of Jung's psychology. Now, this we're going to just play for most of the rest of the time, so that if you get bored with what I'm saying, you'll have something to look at. This is a graph generated by a computer of an equation. And its equation, the results of which are plugged back into the variables of the equation and recomputed over and over and over again. Kind of like perception and experience. When we perceive, our perceptions influence our experience. When we have an experience, the experiences influence our perceptions. And this feedback loop going over and over and over has a significant effect on our personalities. If you say to a computer, here's the graph, or here's the equation for that, which we'll go over tomorrow. We'll be doing a little more with chaos theory tomorrow. Y is a function of R times Y times 1 minus Y. The equation works on itself, balancing itself all the time when Y is between 1 and 0. And when you say to the computer, compute this equation 2,000 times and graph it, this is what you get. And the 2 things that are important about fractal attractors, well, there are 150 things that are important, but 2 that are really interestingly important are they are self-similar across scale. They produce these discernible patterns. But if at any time you ask the computer to tell you where the line is between 2 aspects of this computer-generated image, there is no line. It goes on forever with no actual differentiation. You'll see that. They'll begin to kind of zoom in on some of these aspects of this Mandelbrot set type thing going on here and show you how at the boundaries where some of the equation is going in one direction, the other is going the other direction, there is no line between the 2. Remember that, because when we talk about tensions of opposites, it's going to be very important. What are we talking about? It is now about maybe 20 minutes that I've been talking to you, and I'm going to tell you what this is about. It's about morphogenesis. We're talking about morphogenesis. That's what the psychoid is. Morph meaning shape, genesis meaning the generation of, or the changing of. How is it that the shapes in the mind get changed? How is it that through life we get changed? Well, let's kind of take a look at the moment at the physiology of it. From the moment of conception, 1 sperm and 1 egg come together, 2 cells. They combine, they exchange their genetic material. 2 cells. And before long, the nervous system begins to form. Nerves are the first of the cells to form. And then fingers form, and noses, and eyes, and hair, and toenails, and hearts, and lungs, and endocrine system. All of this forms from where? What? How? How does this happen? From 2 cells. How does this happen? And then we're born. Whoa, okay, now we're a little infant, you know. We can't walk, we can't talk. Hopefully we can suck, because if we can't suck, we can't eat. But slowly, physiologically, we begin to change. We get bigger and bigger. And as we get bigger and bigger, we can do more and more things. We learn how to eat, we learn how to talk, we learn how to walk, we learn how to do all of these things that are fun, ride bicycles, go skiing, go swimming, all these wonderful things. And even when we get to be this age, our bodies are still changing. Only this time, it's not quite as happy as it was before. This time we're kind of getting a little more limited in what we can do, and we don't look so hot. So we dress up more, nice time, because that's about all we can do. It happens psychologically as well. We know that the body develops physiologically, but so does the mind. We know that we generate neurons in our brains throughout life. Not only do we reprogram our synapses, we grow new nerves. So we are constantly in a stage of morphogenesis. We are constantly morphing into something else. So what we want to know is, psychologically, how do we identify that, cooperate with it when it seems to work well, frustrate it when it doesn't seem to be working well? How do we identify that? Now, from the Jungian perspective, we'd say, we look at the archetypes. From the scientific perspective, we would say we look at the genetics. And there are 2 aspects of genetics that are very important. Genetics, which is the blueprint of the psyche, and epigenetics, which are the contractors who take that blueprint and convert it into stuff. So we're going to talk a little bit about that for a moment. We're going to talk about DNA. And just to make it kind of more interesting than talks about DNA can be, here are some statistics about DNA. The total length of DNA in each one of our cells is how long? Anybody know this? It's very interesting. About 6 feet. There are about 6 feet of DNA in every one of our cells. If all the DNA strands in all of our cells were combined, just crumpled up together, they would fit into a box the size of an ice cube. However, if you took that box where all the DNA strands from all of our cells are crumpled up together, and you connected them end to end, how far would they reach? Well, you don't really know, because it's hard to say how large particular strands of DNA are, but you can give a lower limit and an upper limit. It would stretch at least 70 times from the Earth to the sun and back, and maybe as much as 500 times from the Earth to the sun and back. That's 93 million miles, folks. 93 million miles, and that's the DNA we have in our body, all of which contains, genes and alleles and chromosomes and all the whole stuff of DNA that we all talk about, all of which is influencing our behavior. And we tend to see DNA as the blueprint. It's the blueprint. We're born with it. It's there, fine, no problem, and it stays that way throughout life, except there are these things called gamma rays, which we are all being bombarded with at the moment. And if one of them happens to hit one of our chromosomes in a particular place, it's going to create a mutation. And that mutation is going to change who and what we are. Well, that's kind of frightening, okay? Or there are these things called transposons. And transposons are basically little pieces of DNA that have the wanderlust. They don't really like to stay where they are. They want to move around a bit. They want to move around until they find a nice little spot of DNA on a chromosome to combine with, and they plop themselves down, and the genome has changed completely. There are these things called plasmids. These are transposons that are circular. Oh, very archetypal, very circular things. They're bigger. They like to go around from various places and insert themselves into DNA and change it too. So when we talk about random changes in DNA, it's a little more complex than that. because there's all this stuff going on. And then there are those wonderful, wonderful DNA influencers that we all love so well, viruses. And viruses just love to get into our genome because they can't replicate themselves. They can't even live. They're not alive. Viruses are not alive. They don't have any mitochondria. They can't generate their own energy. They can't keep themselves alive. They're closer to rocks than they are to living things. They're just these little pieces of DNA that kind of float through the air and get into us. And when they get into us, like the poor little worm that is, needs to use our DNA and our whole genome to replicate itself, it's got to get into somebody else's genome too. So I'm standing up here and lecturing to you, and I have a virus, and suddenly it's like, and then I say, well, hi, how are you? Nice to see you tonight, And the person goes, well, nice to see you. And then they're kind of licking their finger to open the book or something, and the virus is in them. Probably 80% of our behavior is parasitically derived. Yeah? Okay? Now, several of us, or many of us, have children. They change your behavior real fast, and they are completely parasitic. They rely on us to survive. And if they can't change our behavior, then they don't survive. When my older sister had her first child, and she would feed the child, she would eat what the child left on the plate. And I would leave the room or I would throw up. I was so disgusted by this. I would say, Nancy, how can you do that? Because, here's this little snotty-nosed kid, eating, and he didn't want to eat this, and he'd leave it there, and my sister would be, are you done? Okay. And so she'd eat it up, Then I had children, and one night I discovered I was sitting there finishing my daughter's food after she didn't want it, and enjoying it. I thought, this is a chemical change. This is a shift. This little parasite has completely altered my body chemistry so that I'm doing something now that I never would do otherwise. I'm like the ant who's now on the top of the grass. Ridiculous. Well, that's how the genome itself changes. But the genome, in order to become anything, has to first be transcribed from DNA into RNA, and then translated from RNA into proteins. And all the enzymes and all the little chemicals that facilitate that process are called the epigenetic aspect, the beyond genetic aspect of genetics. And they change things too. They influence things a lot. Have any of you heard of prions? Prions are misfolded proteins. They don't fold the way they're supposed to. And they're responsible for such things as bovine spongiform encephalopathy, otherwise known as mad cow disease, where your brain just suddenly gets these holes. Your proteins in your brain fold wrong, and there's no brain there. There's just space. These prions. So prions have a very, very bad name because they misfold. But now they're discovering that in the yeast genome, the prions, by misfolding, make the yeast better able to survive different conditions that they've never encountered before. So we have all of this stuff going on in our genome that actually works to make it possible for us to survive things that otherwise would kill us. But it's not conscious. Were it conscious, it would do it a little more logically, and it wouldn't create bovine spongiform encephalopathy. Now, the last thing I want to talk about with regard to science, because we're going to talk about it again in a few minutes, are antibodies. Antibodies, as we all know, are absolutely essential for the immune system. These are the things that when they identify something coming into our body that is not of the body, that could potentially be a threat to our health, they go out and engage it. Now, this is what antibodies are. Antibodies are basically receptors that are on B cells. B cells are part of our blood system, and they have these little receptors on them. And when something comes in that the body doesn't recognize, or that the B cell does not recognize, the receptor splits off. And it goes, and it has a heavy chain, 2 heavy chains, and 2 light chains, and these areas here hypermutate. They have 4 different areas, J, D, and F, something like J, D, and V, and something else. And these 4 areas all start hypermutating until they find the chemical combination that binds to what we call an antigen. And once it binds with that, it sends a signal to this part of the antibody, which alerts what we call the innate immune system. We're born with it. This is the adaptive. This adapts to what's there. The innate immune system will attack anything that comes in. It calls the innate immune system and says, we got a problem here. Come and take care of this for us. And it does. The macrophages come and they clean it up. The natural killer cells come, they all that kind of thing. So what's happening here is this antigen, this B cell receptor, is able to identify anything that comes into the body that is not of the body and neutralize it. How does it do that? It's not sitting there thinking, oh, we've got an invader here, we need to do something, okay, let's just try this, let's try that. It all just happens physically, chemically, and it's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant. We're going to talk a little more about that in a minute. So in terms of Jung, what are we talking about? We're talking about archetypes. Archetypes are the morphogenetic agents of the psyche. So we have morphogenetic agents in the psyche. What did Jung call them? He called them archetypes. Call them anything you want. You could call them Herman, and they're still the same. They're a morphogenetic element in the psyche that is changing things. Now, in volume 10, this is how he describes archetypes. The archetypes are, as it were, the hidden foundations of the conscious mind, or to use another comparison, the roots which the psyche has sunk, not only in the earth in the narrower sense, our bodies, but in the world in general. Archetypes are systems of readiness for action, and at the same time, images and emotions, which is essentially how archetypes reveal themselves by combining with material from our daily lives. They are inherited with the brain structure. Indeed, they are its psychic aspect. They represent, on the one hand, a very strong instinctive conservatism, while on the other hand, they are the most effective means conceivable of instinctive adaptation. Adaptation, this whole thing of morphogenesis. They are thus essentially the chthonic portion of the psyche, if we may use such an expression, that portion through which the psyche is attached to nature, or in which its link with the earth and the world appears at its most tangible. The psychic influence of the earth and its laws is seen most clearly in these primordial images. This is what science is talking about. This is what Jung is talking about. Jung says archetypes. Science uses antibodies, parasites, cytokines, all of these various enzymes, caspase inhibitors, all of this stuff. That's what they talk. That's what they call it. So a couple of things about archetypes you have to remember, and this is where we really get interesting. First, when we look at archetypes, they are not teleological. They're not aiming towards something. They're not trying to get somewhere. As Jung said, they are final. They're directional. They're just going in a particular direction. So one of the things in psychology we have to always be aware of is not to mistake where something is heading for the intent of that direction. We don't know if it's going to end up there. Psychology is very oriented towards saying, oh, here's the symptom, it's heading, oh, this is where it's going, oh, this is what it is. You know how that works? We're going to talk about that a little bit. Archetypes are generated by tensions of opposites. And tensions are not differentiatable. This is why archetypes are irrepresentable. This is why we can't see them. A tension is a dynamic. A tension is not a static entity, here, like a tug of war where both sides are completely evenly matched. Tensions are oscillations. They're going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. Take, for example, the development of the nervous system. The development of the nervous system starts right after conception. And neural precursor cells are the cells that put together the nerves of the embryo, of the fetus. How does that happen? Well, listen to this. When histones and chromatin, those are parts of the genome, come into the right configuration, when there are key intrinsic changes in histone H3 acetylation. Acetylation turns genes on, and trimethylation, methylation turns genes off. At the NGN1 and the NGN2 promoters in the neural precursor cells, such that at the early stages there is high acetylation and low methylation, but at later stages, low acetylation and high methylation. Now, if you followed all of that, which is utterly ridiculous, why would you want to do that? The important thing to realize is that in order for the neural cells to develop, these various tensions have to reverse. The bifurcations that oscillate have to bifurcate. Now we're in chaos theory. That's the primary principle of chaos theory. A dynamic system bifurcates into two oscillating systems, which then bifurcate into 4 oscillating systems, then bifurcate into 16 oscillating systems, 8, 16, kind of thing. So they're not representable. And now we're going to get to the meat of what we're talking about tonight. The archetype is a dynamism, says Jung, which makes itself felt in the numinosity and fascinating power of the archetypal image. And there was a recent article on Joyce Carol Oates in the New York Times Book Review, and the reviewer said that the prolific force that she refers to as JCO, Joyce Carol Oates, whom she has elsewhere described as not a person or even a personality, but a process that has resulted in a sequence of texts. We are all processes. Each one of us here is a process. We are not a static entity for 1 minute in our lives, except if we take a snapshot. That's what makes snapshots so incredibly interesting. They take this process that we are and catch it and make it static. And we look at it and we go, oh my God, geez, I don't ever want to see that again. Oh, terrible. Who took that? So what does this mean? Well, for Jungians especially, it has a very interesting influence, all of this stuff, on our concepts of mental illness. Now, mental illness, as Harry Stack Sullivan, the father of American psychiatry, said, is a matter of degree, not kind. In other words, mental illness is normal behavior, normal functioning, occurring at a level that is considered to be extreme by the group in which the person lives. So we are all psychotic. Yeah? I mean, go to a basketball game, go to a soccer game, go to any number of things and see people acting really psychotically, and we get psychotic too. But it's acceptable, it's normal, no problem, because we go in and out of it, not a problem at all. We can go to other countries and we'll find that a much higher level of psychosis is tolerated as normal than in our culture, as well as other things too. So mental illness is a matter of degree. The exaggeration, if you will, of something otherwise considered normal. I travel all over the world. I go to all these various places in the world, war zones mostly, and I'm routinely confronted with behavior that is very uncomfortable to me, because here in the United States it would be considered aberrant, and in that culture it's considered to be perfectly normal, and vice versa. People from those cultures come to this culture and they're like, what is wrong with you people? You guys are ill. How can you possibly do this? We routinely bring people from Africa over to Olympia to work with them on trauma issues. And the one thing they always say is, why do you people have to make appointments with each other to get together? We walk home and the house is open. We go into somebody's house and we've just lost our sound. Why did I lose my sound? I was gesturing too wildly. Hang on. Wait a minute. We're good. Thanks. What do you got?
I think you just knocked it.
What did I do? Maybe it's an act of God here in the cathedral.
I thought you knocked it off.
I knocked it. Okay. Well, maybe it's over here. Maybe I hit the.
No, it's still on. Let's turn it off for a second.
Maybe reboot the system.
Yep. Try it again.
Yeah, maybe I hit the mute on that or something. Okay. Oh. This guy's good. You've bailed me out year after year. So what we say is, well, we make appointments with each other because we can't just drop in on each other. Well, why not? We bring them here in August. By November, they understand why we don't just drop in on each other. We don't go out. So however you drop in, it can't go out. Archetypes express themselves through symbols. The morphogenesis of our psyches, which is trying to help us cope with the challenges that life throws at us, do so by giving us symbols, by taking the routine, ordinary things of our life and investing them with an urgency to either avoid or to be attracted to. This is how archetypes work. They're exaggerated, they're crazy, and when people become under their sway, they are treated with medication in our culture. This is where all of this becomes incredibly important to mental illness, because if mental illness is defined as an exaggeration of the normal, and if everything in the unconscious is, by definition, exaggerated, because it's operating at the level of basic biochemical reactions, which are hugely powerful, and if those represent themselves in symbols, people who are in the grip of the morphogenetic principle trying to cure them will be medicated, because the phenomenon is not sufficiently conscious or rational. And people don't realize, a lot of practitioners don't realize, that as Jung said, the symptom is the attempt at a cure. And what we do is we try to eliminate the symptoms. This could become so bizarre that, for example, I was working with a man, or I was sitting in on a counseling session with a man who was afraid to go out. And he was afraid to go out because he was living in a war zone. Well, it makes perfect sense. You wouldn't want to go out. But a lot of people went out, when the war wasn't active, went up and running. But he would go out one night, and the militants, who basically controlled the area, would come out at night to make sure nothing happened. And he was walking home one night from school, and a militant yelled out, "Who are you?" And he freaked. He just freaked completely, terrified. He gave his name, and the guy says, "Get out, get on." So he went home. And that precipitated a kind of fear of going out. And he couldn't go out unless he was accompanied by somebody. It was very, very difficult for him. So we began to work with him, and I said to him, militants are very frightened people. He said, I don't see that. How can that be? I said, they wouldn't be out patrolling if they weren't frightened. If they weren't afraid that something negative was going to happen if they weren't out there, they wouldn't be out there. So when they yell out to you, "Who are you?" you're hearing two things. You're hearing their aggression and you're hearing their fear. But if you were to go up to them and say, "What are you afraid of?" They go, "I'm not afraid of anything. I'll take you right out." So they're completely separating themselves from an enormous emotion that is coming through in their words, their expression, their inflection, their tone of voice. They're ignoring that, they're denying it, and they're only going with their aggression. And this guy picks up not only his own fear, but their fear. But he has no conceptual framework for that. There's nothing in his culture that says you're picking up on somebody else's emotion and you're feeling it, and that's why you're having an emotion. It's not coming from you, it's coming from them. Nothing like that. So what is it? It's a ghost. It's a ghost. He's being persecuted by ghosts. And the unconscious uses the image of the ghost to say to him, there is something unseen here that is influencing your behavior and your perceptions, and it's not coming from you. So, what does he do? He says to his family, "I'm afraid of ghosts." And what do? They bring him to the mental health center for medication. A complete and total lack of understanding for the morphogenesis of the archetypal realm of the psyche. And here's the core of what we're going to be dealing with tomorrow and the core of my lecture tonight. And that is this: that in early childhood, before we are up and running consciously, decisions are being made for us as to how best to cope with, adapt to, and survive our environments. Now, in Jungian terms, we would say, okay, that morphogenetic principle is happening through the unconscious. The unconscious is adapting to an environment, no matter how much disturbed or disordered that environment is, the unconscious is coming about with ways to deal with that. As we become conscious, we realize that a lot of those adaptive functions are not very useful, and we adopt other ones that are more rational and logical. But those early adaptations don't just exist in some sort of ether, some sort of cloud, computer cloud type thing. They exist in the brain. We know that every experience and every perception is encoded in the brain through synaptic complexity. The synapses adapt to be able to run the brain in a certain way that goes along with what we have learned to do. If we learn to play the piano, we practice. Synapses form, very complex. So when we actually play, we don't really have to think about it that much. We look at the music, we don't really think about where our fingers are because the synapses do this for us. At age 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5, this is happening every day. And these synaptic configurations get completely crystallized in our minds, and eventually, as we, quote, outgrow them, unquote, they become alienated from the ego. They become parts of us with which we are no longer in relationship. And if one of the issues that we have had to deal with early in life, which a lot of people have to deal with, interestingly enough, is rejection, then those synaptic configurations through which our unconscious coped with rejection become problematic later in life so that we want to get rid of them. And we reject the synaptic configurations that were formed as a result of rejection. And it's like pouring gasoline on the flames. We're doing exactly the opposite of what we are supposed to do. So before consciousness forms, who's running the show? We know, for example, through studies, that children in Germany cry differently than children in France. Children in France cry more like the sound of French language. Children in Germany cry more like the sound of German language at 2 weeks of life. Who's running the show? Who's doing that? And that gets encoded synaptically so that when we talk about the inner child, when we talk about the inner self, we have a multitude of inner selves that are synaptically encoded that when they fire not as then, although they are from then, they fire as now. So when we as totally rational adults find ourselves feeling things that we know make no sense in the situation we're in, but we're feeling them strongly, we are feeling the firing of that synaptic adaptive system. And it's firing as if we, right now, in our adult life, are feeling these, and they're not. They're the children inside us. And most of psychology today is oriented towards shutting those children up, getting those children to go away, which is exactly why they formed in the first place. So we are abandoning our feelings of abandonment. Okay. What time is it? Time to quit. How do we gain access to these synaptic configurations? Well, one of the things we've learned from schizophrenia, for example, is that schizophrenia is a mental illness caused by lack of communication in the brain. In other words, neurons aren't communicating with each other that should be communicating each other. So the key to all of this is to create relationship among the various aspects of the brain, of the mind, of the psyche that have lost their connection with each other. Lost their connection with each other because we've outgrown them, lack of connection with each other because we have abandoned them, lack of connection with each other because we wouldn't have survived if we'd stayed connected to them. But now they're functioning autonomously. Jung called these autonomous complexes. The whole point of what we need to do is to form relationships with those split-off aspects of our psyche that are irrational and unconscious and got formed when we were 3 and 4 and 5, or sometimes 34, 35, 42, 48. How do we recognize them? fractal attractors, for one thing. If we find ourselves oscillating, if we find ourselves bifurcating, if we find ourselves involved in configurations that, oh, I'm sorry, I left that up too long, in configurations that don't seem to make much sense but are fascinating to behold. Another way is through trauma symptoms. Flashbacks are a real hallmark of trauma. And there's not one of us sitting in this room who has not been traumatized. It's the easiest diagnosis to make in mental health. I make it all the time because there's not a soul who hasn't been traumatized. We've all been traumatized. Think of, for example, when you had a birthday party and nobody came, or a few people came, or there was a birthday party and you weren't invited to it when you were in 3rd grade. Ooh, that's really trauma. That's hard. Now people say, geez, come on, rise above that. You know, okay, fine, and we did. But the referent for it, the synaptic configuration of that disappointment is still in there, and it fires, and we need to connect with it. And it will come back as flashbacks. We'll experience it in new situations. We'll hear that a good friend of ours went to a party the other night that we weren't invited to. And then we find out later on that we were invited to it, but we didn't get the message. But immediately there's that shock of, my God, how did this happen? Hypervigilance is another symptom of trauma. What are we hypervigilant about? What is our whole culture hypervigilant about? What gets people really riled up really fast? What do we do when we watch the news at night and see the latest demonstration taking place at the latest capital in the United States? What's going on with that? Finally, the best way to make these connections is through active imagination. Of course, we're going to go right back to the Jungian stuff because we're Jungians here, and we're going to say that Jung had the right idea because we all believe that. Active imagination is the process by which we engage consciously elements from the unconscious. It doesn't matter how we do it. Now, if you read books, there are a lot of books written about how to do active imagination. Marie-Louise von Franz says, never do active imagination with somebody living who you know. And that's probably good advice if you can't really differentiate who people are from who they aren't. So, for example, if you believe that Dick Cheney is really the Antichrist, you probably shouldn't be doing active imagination with actual people. But if you can see that, no, that's kind of an exaggeration and maybe not too far off the mark, but at least it's an exaggeration, then you know you can probably do that. Active imagination can be done in any way you want. And you can do it as easily and as fun or as profoundly as you want to do. We're now focusing in on some of the areas between where the graph is going towards 0 and the graph is going towards 1, and they're going to try to find the line between the two. You'll see what happens. So everything depends on creating relationships between consciousness and unconsciousness. And that's what ultimately heals people. And this is kind of what it looks like. There's a great old cartoon by Sidney Harris, and it's two scientists, and they're looking. This is the man who has put all the equations on the board, and this man is saying, I think you should be more explicit in step 2. And step 2 says, then a miracle occurs. And a lot of science is like that. I mean, it really is. You know, for example, you say, okay, well, where does the nerve, where does the whole body come? Well, the first is neural precursor cells. Well, where do they come from? Well, they come from stem cells. Well, where do they come from? Well, they come from the embryonic DNA that's there in the beginning. Where does that come from? Well, turtles. You guys know that one? Right. You know, the Zen student goes to the master and says, what is the world resting on? What holds up the world? And the Zen master says, my daughter. The Zen master says, my daughter, the world rests on a turtle. And the student says, what is the turtle resting on? The master says, the turtle is resting on a turtle. He says, well, what's that turtle resting on? And the master says, it's turtles all the way down. It's a classic old Zen story. A lot of science is actually like that, and so is psychology. So the miracle that happens is what happens when we form relationships within aspects of the brain, of the mind, of our psyche, of our personality, of our soul that have gotten split off. That's the whole point. And if we did it in international affairs, we might be a lot better off. What would it be like in international affairs if we acted like antibodies? Now, antibodies have the anti in them. They're against. Oh, my God. What are they against? Antigens, pathogens. Pathogens that come into the body. Pathogens that come from the word meaning disease. Enemies. And we use the language of warfare for the immune system. We have natural killer cells. We have cytotoxic T cells. We have all of these things. It's war. But it's not. It's not war. What the immune system does is it relates. It connects. It creates relationship between molecules. Never mind that those molecules might kill the organism that they are part of. That's a whole other thing, by demolishing the complexity and reducing it to a simplicity, and there's nothing simpler than a corpse. Right? But what's happening is the relationship that the immune system is creating is transforming things into something else. Suppose we treated terrorists that way. Wouldn't it be interesting if we treated our enemies that way? If we engaged them and we were both mutually transformed by that? What if we took an immunological approach to terrorism? Not by going in and destroying, but by going in and transforming. It's a very, very complex subject, and we're going to end by a quotation from Tolstoy. And I'm going to leave you all hanging. I've given you a lot to think about, and this is what we're going to be doing tomorrow, over and over again. We're going to start with chaos theory, and then we're going to go into this. Tolstoy said in War and Peace, "It is known that man has the ability to immerse himself entirely in one subject, however insignificant it might seem. And it is known that there is no subject so insignificant that it will not expand to infinity if attention is concentrated on it." It's turtles all the way down. And that's what we're doing in Jungian psychology, and that's what we're aware of. And that's why we are often considered to be on the far outback of mental health. Thank you.